They imprisoned our delegation and called it over. The fleet was already home. I have told this story once, to a tribunal that no longer exists, in a chamber whose dome was cracked by then and patched with something that was not glass. I will tell it again here, plainly, because the plain version is the only one worth keeping. I was not the lead envoy. That was Director Vasile Marin, a man who had spent 31 years in diplomatic postings across 4-star systems, and who had developed, somewhere along the way, the particular stillness of a person who has run out of things to fear. I was his second. My job that session was to sit at his left, keep the record, and say nothing. I was very good at my job. The Conclave of Sovereign Worlds held its sessions in a chamber called the Hall of Settled Truths. The name was not modesty. 11 species had a permanent seat at the tiered assembly. 43 held observer status. The architecture was old in the way that only deliberate construction can be. Each stone chosen to remind whoever stood at the floor that the institution above them had already decided, had always decided, and would continue to decide long after the petitioner was dust. The dome overhead was tinted amber. Through it, on a clear session day, you could see the Conclave's own defense fleet hanging in formation. 17 capital ships, lit by their home sun, present and visible by design. A reminder, also by design. We were not there to petition. That distinction mattered to Director Marin, and I had learned to make it matter to me as well. The session opened with what the Conclave's protocol master called the reading of settled accounts. It was a procedural formality in most sessions. That morning it was not. The first arbiter, a Veth elder, gray-scaled, with the slow, deliberate movements of a species that had never needed to hurry, rose from the primary tier and read, in the Conclave's liturgical tongue, Earth's dissolution warrant. I will not reproduce the language here. It was long. It cited 11 precedents, 4 of which had been fabricated within the last decade, and 2 of which predated humanity's knowledge of faster-than-light travel by a margin that would have been embarrassing if embarrassment were a concept the Conclave applied to itself. The warrant declared Earth and all affiliated human settlements to be in material breach of the Conclave's foundational compact, stripped humanity of its observer status, voided all treaty protections, and authorized any sovereign member to act against human assets without liability. It was thorough. They had been drafting it for a long time. Director Marin listened with his hands flat on the table. When the reading was finished, the first arbiter looked down at us. The floor was slightly below the primary tier, another deliberate choice, and said, in translation, that the delegation of Earth was now in the Conclave's custody, pending the warrant's formal inscription into the permanent record, a process that would take 4 days, after which we would be transferred to a member world for indefinite holding. He said this the way you announce a conclusion, not a decision. The conclusion had already been reached. We were simply being informed of it. 4 Conclave wardens moved to our position. They were not unkind about it. The Conclave was not a crude institution. Director Marin did not stand. He did not speak. He looked at the first arbiter for a moment, not the look of a man calculating options, but the look of a man confirming something he had already confirmed some time ago. And then he folded his hands and waited for the wardens to complete their task. I followed his lead, as I had for 11 years. They held us in a suite of rooms beneath the Hall of Settled Truths. Comfortable rooms, which said something about how confident the Conclave was. Comfortable rooms are for guests you do not believe will cause you difficulty. We were brought meals. We were given access to a narrow band of non-priority communications, which the Conclave monitored and which we did not use. There was a window. Through it I could see a courtyard, and, above the courtyard wall, a slice of amber-tinted sky. On the second day, Director Marin slept for 10 hours. I had never seen him sleep that long. I understood, eventually, that it was not exhaustion, it was relief. On the third day, the Conclave's communications officer came to our door. She was a young Veth, which meant she had not been in the institution long enough to have the stillness her elder colleagues carried. She told us, in a careful voice, that the Conclave's long-range relay network was experiencing intermittent disruption across several sectors. She asked if we had any knowledge of technical difficulties on human-administered relay stations. Director Marin told her that he did not. She left. She came back 2 hours later and said that the disruption had expanded. She was careful not to use the word she meant, which was systematic. On the 4th morning, the day the warrant was to be inscribed. The first arbiter came himself. He did not send a warden. He came to the door of our comfortable rooms and stood in the corridor. And for the first time since I had arrived on Conclave territory, I saw the stillness leave him. He said that there were ships at the edge of the home system. He said there were a great many of them. He said they had been there. Here he paused in the way of a being recalibrating something fundamental. For 11 days. Director Marin nodded once. He said, "We told you there would be consequences." That was the entirety of what he said. The first arbiter stood in the corridor for a moment longer. The amber light through the window at the end of the hall caught the scaling along his neck and turned it the color of old copper. He was very old, and in that moment he looked it. He asked Director Marin what the ships were waiting for. Director Marin said, "For us to walk out." He did not say, "We placed those ships 11 days ago, the day we received your summons, because we had read your intent before you read us your warrant." He did not say, "Every relay your communications ran through was logged and mapped by the time we sat down at your table." He did not say, "The disruption your officer described is not a malfunction." He said none of this because none of it required saying. The first arbiter was old and he was not slow, and he had just finished doing the arithmetic. The conclave released us that afternoon. The warrant's inscription was postponed indefinitely, a status it retains to this day, in whatever archive still bothers to maintain it. We walked through the Hall of Settled Truths on the way out. The session was not in progress. The chamber was empty, the tiered seats vacant. The amber dome above us, letting in the light of a sun that had risen and set 4 times while we sat in comfortable rooms below. Director Marin did not look up at the dome. I did. The conclave's 17 capital ships were still there, visible in formation through the amber glass. Exactly where they had always been. He was already at the door. I caught up to him in the corridor, and we walked out together into the courtyard, and then through the courtyard gate, and the gate closed behind us with the sound of an institution that was still deciding whether what had just happened had, in fact, happened. Director Marin never discussed it afterward, not with me. Not, as far as I know, with anyone. He retired 2 years later, to a place with no communication infrastructure worth mentioning, and I have not spoken to him since. I think about that walk through the empty chamber sometimes, the dome, the fleet through it that was theirs, and somewhere beyond the amber glass, invisible and patient, the one that was ours, already home, waiting.